Well, thank you so much for being here, everyone. And we have got a lot to get to today. And knowing this group, we probably won't get to all of it, but we're going to try and do our best. All right, so let's get to it. Mark, I really want to start with you. I know you're in the hot seat. I want to start with you and the 2024 election. The primary argument that President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris made in their campaigns was that former President Donald Trump was a danger to democracy because he refused to concede the 2020 election. He called for the arrest and prosecution of his political enemies and displayed authoritarian tendencies. He went on to win every single battleground state, including Georgia, and the Electoral College and the national popular vote. So why don't you think that that was an effective argument, and how should we read the results of the 2024 election?
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you all for having us. May I just start off by saying we're talking about the future of democracy, and we have democracy here on stage. Democracy is so well represented here on stage. You don't have a healthy democracy without the fourth estate, without the press. And you have two active members of the press in Meridith and Francesca, and you don't have a healthy democracy without those who aren't willing to uphold it. The principles of our nation are just ideas etched in parchment unless we are willing to enact them. And sitting to my right is a very courageous public servant who was willing to do so. So this is democracy to a large extent. Francesca, to answer your question, I think, look, we saw democracy play out on election night. We had a free and fair election, and the American people voted Donald Trump as their president, the first non-consecutive presidency since Grover Cleveland. He will be both our 45th and 47th president. I think I was pleased that he not only got the Electoral College, but to your point, he got the popular vote. He got all of the swing states. This was a decisive victory for Donald Trump. And we as Americans have to abide by that. We have to accept the results of the election. That's part of the bargain about being an American. I think you're right, he did flout democratic norms during the course of his presidency. I think that January 6th was nothing less than treason, trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election. But at the end of the day, I think Donald Trump won for two reasons. He won because of economic discontent and cultural disaffection, cultural disconnection by so many. And that was stronger for many Americans than was this threat to democracy, which we've been talking about ever since Donald Trump descended that shiny escalator of Trump Tower in 2015.
Mr. Secretary of State, who he said we can call him Brad, so we'll refer to you that way moving forward. Were those arguments from Democrats overblown in your view?
Well, obviously, post-2020 election, it was a wild time. We lived through it. But at the end of the day, I still think that our democracy is healthy. If you look in Georgia, we had record turnout. We had 5.3 million people that voted in this election, a record number. We had record turnout, and people really participated in the election. And I think when people participate, and then you have free, fair, and fast elections like we had in Georgia, that they're very accurate. You may not like the results, but you can't argue with the results because that's what the free will of the people was. But I think it actually shows a healthy democracy, and I think there should be healthy debate. I think that as a conservative, I should be able to show up anywhere and have a respectful conversation. And really, that's what we did in the General Assembly. Even though I sat next to a Democrat on both sides, we always had respectful conversations. And I do think that's one of the things we have to really lean into and get back to in America. You can have strongly held views, but I think we need to have strong conversations, respectful conversations. But I think right now it is healthy. America has a lot of issues, and we have a lot of things to work on. So the politics is really done. Now it's to get back to business because, we conservatives have run out of plank about economic issues, a strong border. So now is the time to really make things better for every American. I think that when you hold elected office statewide, that's really what my job has always been. Is I understand and I represent every Georgian. And my job is to make sure we have fair elections for everyone. And when you're the president of the United States, you work for everyone. And trying to bring people together, I think, is really important.
Meredith, Trump's victory was decisive, as we have discussed, and he even expanded his electorate. Why do you think that so many Americans decided to give him a second chance?
Well, I think in elections, people are always looking for the change candidate. And I think in this past election, even though we saw Vice President Kamala Harris go to the top of the ticket after President Biden stepped down, I think she and her campaign really struggled to articulate to the American people how they were going to affect change and how they were going to differentiate themselves, I think, from the Biden administration. And I think she had she ran a really excellent campaign, and she ran a very hard-fought campaign. But I do think some of the economic realities of the past few years, like inflation, we saw in a lot of the exit polls that was still a top concern for a lot of Americans, and especially that undecided, very small slice of the electorate. It was a close election, and it was a really small slice of the electorate that decided things, and their concerns about the economy really were top of mind in all the polling that we saw.
And Mark, you brought up the economy in your first answer. There was also this perception from voters that Trump would be better on the economy, that they would be better off if he was president. Why do you think that was?
I just think there was better messaging. I mean, Donald Trump is a strongman. He has the image of a strongman, the person who is the only one who can fix a problem. That may or may not be true, but much of the American people believe that message, that he is able to fix the economy. Much of the inflation that we saw was a hangover from the Trump presidency, as it happens, because of COVID, supply chains, and so forth. But Trump had a better ability to talk about the fact that he could fix it and had more credibility. I think, frankly, the image of him as the apprentice, this successful business person, still prevails. People still think that Donald Trump understands things intuitively because he had a successful career as a business person. That's the image that he projected in The Apprentice. That's the image he projected as our 45th president. And it was the image he projected as a candidate in this election cycle. And it was more powerful, to Meredith's point, than the messaging from Kamala Harris, who I think ran an enormously effective campaign. She had only 13 weeks to do so. We can't discount the fact that she really didn't have a fulsome opportunity to really show the American people who she is. And to your point, Americans want change. The pendulum naturally swings in American history from one side to the next. And we had a dramatic swing on one side, and we're going to see a dramatic swing almost invariably to the other side. It's just a matter of when. So I think change was an effective message in this election cycle, and obviously it won out.
Brad, she had economic plans. Do you think she just didn't explain how she'd bring down costs well enough for Americans?
Well, it gets into politics, and I try and stay out of that as Secretary of State, but I don't think she was an effective communicator on that. And I do think that pocketbook issues, the kitchen table issues were really important for Americans, for Georgians, of rural, urban. It really didn't matter, suburban. When you had high inflation like we had, income had not increased at that same level, people were hurting. And so there was an awful lot of economic issues. And then really, the border had been open, and it been open at a level that we hadn't ever seen before. And there's really on her side, an answer on how you're really going to truly fix it. What was your plan for that? And people were concerned. People were concerned about losing their job. They're also concerned about crime that's coming across, and then also concerned about the drug issue. And as a sovereign nation, I've always believed that we should have secure borders, and there should be a lawful path for immigration and towards citizenship. I think most Americans agree with that, but it just it was really for several years it was just really out of control, and so it was just a really deep hole for her to try and dig out of. And obviously I think that's really what proved out in the polling also.
Meredith, over the weekend, the president-elect said in an interview that he would seek retribution in the form of success. What are you hearing from your sources about that and about how he'll approach democratic norms as someone who's covered him both inside and outside of office?
Yeah, well, two of the major themes of the past election with Trump was retribution and was disruption of the federal government. And we've seen how during the campaign, how Donald Trump would talk about wanting to seek retribution. But I think what we saw in this interview over the weekend with NBC's Kristen Welker is sort of mixed signals on it. Him saying that he wants to seek retribution with success. He's not going to call for his attorney general to go after his enemies unless they find that they've done something unlawful and they're worthy of being investigating, but he's not going to go after them. And yet retribution is something that we have heard him talk about over and over again on the campaign trail. And so while I think it was a major theme for him, I do think that was an interesting moment in him saying that he is not going to be looking towards the past, even though that was, again, such a big part of his argument.
And Mr. Secretary of State, you know better than anyone here what it's like to be on the other end of a Trump pressure campaign. Do you have confidence that the nation's system of checks and balances will hold up in the next administration?
I believe so. People are elected to do their job, and if everyone does their job, U.S. senators should do theirs, Congress, the president. They have a lot on their plate right now, and particularly on world affairs. If you look at what we have going on in Lebanon, in Ukraine, and Gaza, and now Syria, they're going to be very busy with foreign affairs. And many people sometimes run on one issue, and then they find out all of a sudden they're going to have to put some focus on this. And you only have so many hours in the day, so they're going to be pretty busy with a lot of different issues. And as an American, I wish them all the very best. That we all want peace. We all want peace through strength. We want great economic times. We want economic opportunity. And as a manufacturing person, I had a manufacturing plant in Columbus and also in Forsyth County. I think I'm very hopeful that we're going to bring more manufacturing back to America. Just think about it, in the 80s in Georgia, we had GM Doraville, and then we had Ford down in Hapeville. Those are good paying jobs. And so if we can bring things like that back to America, and I think you can do a lot of that through incentives, that through full expensing of new manufacturing facilities, whether it's IT, whatever that is. But as soon as the first product goes out the door, you can then write off your entire investment. I think you'll see an awful lot of investment for manufacturing come back to America. And I think that would be a good thing for hardworking Americans, hardworking Georgians.
Mark, he brought up foreign policy. What do you expect from Trump's presidency and America's relationships with democracies around the world?
Francesca, let me just contextualize, if I can go back to the election for a second.
Sure.
And Trump's, I think it bears mentioning, and Meredith mentioned this before, but kitchen table issues always play a vital role in any election. It's not only looking forward to the future, it's often based on kitchen table issues, unless there's a bigger external issue that we need to face, a world war, 9/11, something like that. But this harkened back, this election harkened back to two in recent years. One was, when one-term presidents were trying to get reelected. One was Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan faced Jimmy Carter, the incumbent president, and he asked Americans, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And overwhelmingly, Americans believed that they weren't better off, primarily because of an inflationary economy. And guess what? Ronald Reagan wins in a landslide. George H.W. Bush is president in 1988. He runs for re-election in 1992. The economy is starting to slow. He's raised taxes despite a promise he made not to do so. Gets challenged by Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton's political advisor, James Carville, tells him, look, the message is easy. It's the economy, stupid. People are worried about kitchen table issues. They're worried about the economy. And guess what? Those two incumbent presidents were defeated by these challengers based on that economic. So this happens pretty frequently. I think in terms of foreign policy, I don't know. That's one of the things that I worry about. We saw a very weakened NATO during the first Trump administration. I think one of the things that President Biden should get credit for is revitalizing NATO, particularly around the liberation of of Ukraine from Russian invasion. Trump has shown, he has a fascination with autocrats, including Vladimir Putin. So that's something I worry about. We have a foreign policy philosophy that has been upheld by every president since Franklin Roosevelt that has more or less kept the peace, kept security in the world, by and large, since World War II. And I don't want to see that disrupted. We'll see what happens with foreign policy. But one more point, that is, and you made the point, Mr. Secretary, you can run on one thing, but circumstances can deal you a very different hand. George W. Bush ran as the education president. He intended to reform our education system. That's how he wanted to be remembered. That's what was an effective message to get him the presidency, and then 9/11 happened. So there are things that a president can't foresee that play a major role in directing his presidency.
Well, let's talk about some of those appointments that could play a major role in his presidency. Meredith, the president-elect, has made a flurry of appointments since he won the election. Several of them have been controversial. 2 have already dropped out. Can you take us inside of that process, especially his economic picks?
Yeah, it's been a flurry of announcements in a very short amount of time. When Trump was doing his transition back in 2016, it was all in front of the public eye at Trump Tower. You are all familiar with the images of the big gold elevators, and they had press set up and people would be paraded through. So you always had a good idea of who was being interviewed for the job and who Trump was talking to. Now it's all being held behind closed doors down at Mar-a-Lago. In one of those big gilded ballrooms that they have there, they have tables set up where his team is sitting around, and they actually have television screens so Trump can watch how people perform on television, and that's part of how he thinks of some of these picks. If you notice, there's a big Fox News theme with a lot of the people that he has selected for his cabinet. He really feels that, I think, if they're a good communicator on television, they'll be a good communicator of his policies in his government. So some of these picks, I'll be honest with you, surprised me. They were not on anybody's list, nobody's bingo cards. I can't tell you that Pete Hegseth was somebody that people saw coming for his nominee for Secretary of Defense, and his nomination really hangs in the balance on Capitol Hill. But he's also brought some, a really, I would say, a MAGA mosaic of people into his cabinet. It's really, some of these people have very conflicting ideas, I think, of how the world works and really what Trump's political movement means. So I'm going to be watching over the next several years as I'm covering this story, how these different ideologies that Trump's cabinet picks are bringing to the table really are working. You brought up Trump's economic picks. I think from Wall Street there was a sigh of relief when he picked Scott Bessent. He is a hedge fund manager who is very well known on Wall Street, and it's been interesting to look back on some of his comments about tariffs in particular. We've all heard about how Donald Trump likes to wield and use tariffs. On the campaign trail, he would say things like he thinks tariff is the most beautiful word in the world, more beautiful than love, and things like that. So it sort of shows you how much importance he puts on tariffs as not only a part of his economic agenda, but also his national security agenda as well. And Scott Bessent was somebody who said he thinks of tariffs as like a loaded gun you put on the table that is ready to deploy, but it seems like he views tariffs more as sort of an economic threat than something that they'll be using. Yet at the same time, Donald Trump has made clear that he really feels that tariffs are something that he wants to be part of the implementation of his government from day one. And you saw how Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came down to Mar-a-Lago to make a visit with him after Trump had threatened 25% tariffs on Canadian imports. So that's going to be a big part of all of it as well.
Brad, you talked earlier about the US Senate needing to do its job. Is there anyone on Trump's cabinet list who you think that the Senate should reject? I mean, you know a couple of the people he's picked.
No, I haven't really paid that much attention. We've been finishing up the election, and really we're getting ready for next session. And that's really a federal issue, and it's going to be what it's going to be. I just have to lean in and trust, the Senate will do their job. The president nominates good people, and they get down to business. And that's really why, when you're given responsibility, your job is to do your job and make things happen. So I'm still kind of enjoying the election we had here in Georgia. We got pretty high approval ratings, and we worked hard at that. And if they put that same effort at thinking out of the box, but making things better for everyday Americans, they'll have success.
And Mark, as we come to a close here, you talked earlier about the pendulum swing in America, and you were drawing some comparisons, I think, between 1968 and LBJ and what we've seen more recently with President Joe Biden deciding not to run for re-election. Could you put that in a little bit more context for us and tell us what you do see for the future of American democracy?
It's a big question for a short amount of time. But again, you see these radical swings one way or another. Sometimes they're a little more modest. I mentioned George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, not a big swing, right? There wasn't a huge difference in policy. This is as big a difference between candidates and administrations as I've seen in my lifetime. To go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden back to Donald Trump, those are some major swings. And I think it reflects how much is going on in the world, how much we have changed. A lot of that's economically driven. That's because of the economy and how many variables there are in this economy, how much dramatically things have changed. But the one thing I think we can agree on, whether we're swinging one way or another, is that we want our president to succeed. And we're about to inaugurate our 47th president, and I think as Americans, we should all wish him success and hope for the very best as we go forward as a nation.
Well, thank you. We are out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you very much, Francesca.